Greetings. My name is Ray Anderson, and it is my honor to speak at your conference in Chengdu. I wanted to be there in person and was disappointed when those plans were dashed. Hence, I am preparing this and presenting from Johannesburg, South Africa, with the associated computer noises as we click through the buttons. It's been done with the assistance of Pravin Burra, both preparation and filming. Many of you are familiar with my first book from 2007, The Credit Scoring Toolkit. It was translated into Mandarin by Xianglin Li, one of this conference's organizers. Last year, I published a new book, Credit Intelligence and Modeling, which was initially 420 pages, but has since grown by another 200. An addition was Model Risk and Management, which has become a hot topic in recent years. My topic today is model risk management, the shocking truth. With COVID-19, both governments and businesses have been scrambling with severe implications for modeling. What follows is presented in 6 parts: model risk and its management, some available analytics around shock events, and specifics around COVID-19, expectations and needs for the future, and a wrap-up with some key takeaways. One must not see the information presented here as original. In the 12th century, Bernard de Chartres stated that we are like dwarves riding on the shoulders of giants who can see more and further, not because of ability, but because of position. That applies to much in my books and in this presentation, which has borrowed heavily upon the work of others. Before starting, there are a couple of things that I would like to address. First is my connection to China. Second is more background about myself. Many of you will know of Norman Bethune. I was born and brought up in Canada, which established relations with the People's Republic of China in 1970. The Canadians were surprised when the delegation asked to visit Gravenhurst, Ontario, his birthplace. Who on earth is Norman Bethune, they thought. They soon came to learn that he was a hero in China. His stay was brief, less than 2 years before he passed away in 1939. But his dedication was so great that Mao Zedong wrote a eulogy that later became part of the Chinese school curriculum. I was a schoolboy when this happened, but still remember it, and have since visited China twice as a tourist, including Chengdu on one visit, and have developed a fascination for the country. Bethune's story resonates with me, as like him, I seem to have developed a following in China, albeit within your very small community. As regards me, in the upcoming slides, you'll see a lot of imagery relating to Canada's Old West and sailing ships, 2 concepts that typically do not go together. It might help to understand why. I grew up on the Canadian prairies in a small city called Medicine Hat, an abbreviation of Medicine Man's Hat, a name given in the 1880s when it was a simple river crossing. Those First Nation origins are evident in its symbols, the shaman and his headdress, and the world's largest teepee. The Gas City emblem relates to its situation on a natural gas field that supported the economy for decades, along with the railroad and farming. Beyond the river valley, the terrain is much like the Mongolian steppes, but flatter. It is mostly grasslands with various sorts of strange creatures. If I'm not mistaken, that picture was taken somewhere between the city and our family farm. It is Canadian cowboy country, an area first built on ranching and farming, with the later benefit of oil. Calgary, where I went to university, is home to the world's oldest and largest rodeo. Unlike the American Old West, however, guns played a lesser role. There were better relations with Indigenous Canadians who looked up to the Great White Queen, Victoria, and the territories had the stabilizing influence of a respected police force. And sailing? Our Old West did not have sailing schooners, but prairie schooners. And for whatever reason, those hours on horseback seemingly made our prairie boys better sailors, or at least better able to deal with seasickness. I left Canada in 1980 to work in Germany and travel Europe, but never went back other than for visits. Johannesburg has been my home since 1981, a place that one might call the Wild South. 34 of those years were spent with the Standard Bank of South Africa, where I worked first in project finance and then credit scoring, both in South Africa and rest of Africa. I left in 2015 to do short-term work with the International Finance Corporation on projects in various emerging market countries, all relating to small business lending. My career in credit scoring now spans 25 years, and I enjoy sharing my insights with others. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Models come with risks, but what type of model? What types of risks? Flat Earth is a model, which, if correct, would pose real risks for those sailing close to the edge. Some people still think the Earth is flat. Nobody ever found that edge, nor did they ever see the giants on whose shoulders the Earth was supposedly resting. There is a quotation attributed to George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. What he really said was that many statistical techniques make assumptions that seldom hold up in practice, but the resulting techniques can prove useful should they pass the dangerous test of usefulness. The flat Earth model was useful for those who believed the Earth was the center of the universe, but it outlived its usefulness. Of course, George Box was referring to statistical models. When I search for images of models on the internet, the first that always comes up are fashion models. That is the most common association. But there are other models: infrastructure, processes, situations, relationships. If the models are toys, there is no risk unless a child eats it or beats another child with it. In the adult world, though, our models are used to guide decisions, and bad models can lead to bad decisions. Most literature on model risk relates to financial models, but the concepts apply across all model types. There are 5 basic origins that are loosely aligned with the model life cycle. Some may seem obvious, but others not. Conceptual issues arise from the theories and assumptions inherent in the chosen methodologies, and whether or not they are appropriate for the problem. If the basis is wrong, choose another approach. Most of the risks arise from excessive use of judgment and model complexity, especially where models feed upon each other. Within this is a choice of functional form. It could be compared to the styles of paintings. Structural models are those based upon fixed mathematical, logical, or theoretical relationships. Reduced form have no real basis other than that they work. The differences lie in how well we understand them, and my mother always said she does not like any painting she cannot understand. Input issues are obvious ones relating to the quantity and quality of data used, whether for development or thereafter. At the outset, these affect the role of judgment and will influence the choice of statistical technique. Most relates to data quality, especially whether it is relevant, complete, and timeless. We will often take quality for granted and be unaware of upstream changes that affect us. Build issues arise from choices made during model development at any stage. In many cases, decisions are made by junior analysts who do not have sufficient experience to identify issues. If models are material, there should be standardized processes for their development. That said, experimentation should not be discouraged. If there is empirical proof that some new approach provides value, it should be considered. Implementation issues come in several parts. First, from immediate issues relating to transcription and coding, where finger trouble can play a role. Appropriate documentation is crucial, as are test cases and user testing. Also, models are developed with a specific target population in mind. and extreme care must be taken when there are significant deviations. The regularity of parameter updates also falls within this realm. And finally, reporting issues. Are the reports correct? Are they delivered on time to the right audience? And can they be interpreted correctly? The number of reports can be large and require much time to interpret. Wherever possible, this information should be presented in an easy-to-interpret fashion, including summary dashboards. I was tempted to add model decay to this list, and it took me some time to work out why it does not belong. Almost all model decay results from changes in the environment, whether to the target population, regulations, economy, or other factors. By definition, model risk is an operational risk. It relates to people involved in the model lifecycle. Hence, a model decay and the associated instability are not model risks of themselves, but create model risks if inappropriate actions are taken or no action at all. Risk comes in various forms. Some relate to life and limb, like when you have men on horseback charging at you, wielding swords. Others are much less severe, but do not seem so at the time, relating more to livelihoods. In business, most risks relate to livelihoods. Broad categories include, amongst others, strategic, operational, market, credit, and ethical. Risk management is to guard against the adverse consequences of these risks. In our case, it goes further. Model risk management is a new field that came into focus after the subprime crisis of 2007 through 2009, or what we call the Great Recession. It resulted from a housing bubble, but was made worse by models that could not recognize the risks, not just those used by credit rating agencies for the assessment of securities portfolios, but also those employed by credit bureau and financial institutions. Hence, greater governance is being applied. Model management is meant not only to reduce the risks, but also to aid the acceptance of developed models and get greater value from money spent on their development. Most regulatory agencies now demand documented policies, procedures, and guidelines for model risk management. Key requirements are to have roles and responsibilities for the various stakeholders, appropriate actions throughout for processes, and documentation that ensures models can be tracked and reviewed, not just individually, but also in combination. Independent model validation is a no-brainer, as we do not want a fox policing the henhouse. Most published articles refer to 3 lines of defense, a framework used by auditors. The first line is the owner, who develops and uses the model. Most of us will be part of that first line. The second line is internal controls. That starts with model validation, but also includes having a dedicated model risk manager. And third, both audit and regulatory oversight. Their role is not so much to review the models, but rather the procedures in place and to ensure that they are being followed by the other lines. Key within this is to ensure communication between the various levels within the organization, in need right from model owners through to the company executive. It helps to know and apply validators' tools, but it is better to involve both them and other stakeholders throughout the process. And should there be issues, there should be no fear of escalating to higher authorities or of telling daddy. The most common sources of development issues relate to the data used, model construction, whether or not the assumptions are appropriate, and the lack of sufficient back testing. Thereafter come the issues of whether it is appropriate for the population to which it is being applied, whether from the outset or because the population changed or was never considered. One way of addressing some of the risks is to build conservatism into the models, but this can be counterproductive. Be conservative where appropriate, but ensure that it is explicit and quantifiable. Credit rating agencies assign ratings based upon current circumstances, but adjust downwards where there are good reasons. Others have referral ranges where greater diligence is applied, whether expert judgment or other rules. As a final point for this section, companies' management must be able to assess and refresh models as required, whether simple recalibration or full redevelopment. Increasingly, that capability is proving to be either a competitive advantage or even a key to survival. To achieve it, greater engagement is needed with the modeling team. After all, this is a team sport, and team's owners have a vested interest in their team's success. All of this sounds very fine and well, basic good practice, but what if things get very scary? Extreme shocks that are the stuff of nightmares. This is coming back to the men on horseback from earlier, but our interest is not the men being charged upon, but others that suffer from the defeat. The Americans have an expression that comes from the Wizard of Oz story. This isn't Kansas anymore, Toto. Toto was the dog. It is used when people realize that things are not the same and may never be the same again. For interest, when first screened in 1939, it was one of the first commercially successful color movies which heralded a new era in filmmaking, and the Wicked Witch of the West was not that good looking. In recent years, several colorful animal labels have been applied, like Black Swan, Gray Rhino, and Black Elephant, depending upon people's perceptions of probability or severity, when the threat was recognized, and whether they wished to deal with it. And after any event, there is much discussion as to which label should be applied, especially Black Swan, or people come up with new ones. Ultimately, such labels are irrelevant. What matters is how shocks are dealt with, as they all put us to the test. There are 5 broad shock categories. Conflict, which for China include the war against Japan and the Civil War. Natural, the most far-reaching of which are epidemics, but this also includes geological, weather, and extreme man-made events. Bubbles, that result from what Alan Greenspan called irrational exuberance, which are best described as dreams turned nightmares. Market, where there are extreme price movements that affect production or consumption, and regulatory, where the law changes such that business norms are brought into question. Shocks related to conflict are the worst, like the world wars, which will not be discussed. Regulatory shocks are also not covered, as they tend to affect specific industries unless invoked by regime change. What is considered are a UK recession, subprime crisis, Hurricane Harvey, and COVID-19, with the greatest focus on the latter. At this point, I'm going to state the obvious. Arguments are based on experience, which in turn is based on the basic assumption that the future will be like the past. That applies to both rational and empirical arguments, that is, arguments based on pure logic or those based on observation. For the most part, our models are empirical. Shock scenarios affect both. They are drastic changes, business unusual, that bring any assumptions based on experience into question. While preparing this presentation, certain things seemed common to all of these. To avoid repeating them, I'll state them at the start as givens. These are that each shock will be different, score and estimate moves will lag the event, actual will likely be different from the prediction, and government and lender actions cloud predictions. Further givens are that simple models are more robust than complex. Past assumptions can be seriously put to the test. Severity estimates are affected more than probabilities, and judgment and oversight will play a greater role. First up is the UK recession from 1990 to 92. During the 80s, the Margaret Thatcher government promoted home ownership, which created house price inflation. The market plateaued in the late 80s with a rapid decline from the third quarter of 90. As a general rule, recessions will affect lower income groups the most. In this case, at least at the outset, it was the professional classes who were most affected due to the impact on the property market. A study was published by the University of Edinburgh in 1992, which looked at credit card data. Separate models were developed for the 1989 and 90 intakes. When the two were applied to other data, there was a significant swap set. For those not familiar with swap sets, I've made up the numbers on this slide. The major point being that many accepted by one model were rejected by the other. 25% of the rejects, assuming a 20% reject rate is maintained. This highlighted the need for two things. First, to choose appropriate periods, and second, to consider type 1 and type 2 errors. In May this year, FICO's Ethan Dornhill provided some figures for their FICO 8 scores. The Great Recession was mostly caused by a housing bubble that was worse than the American Southwest, including California and Florida. The national average score dropped by 33 points, but by 48 points in the Southwest, and recovery took 4 or more years, tracking the broader economy. Ethan also covered Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas and Louisiana in August of 2017. The recovery was quick, within 1 year. Here he focused on ranking ability. The KS statistic dropped significantly, but then recovered. Default rates also recovered, but remained higher than before the hurricane. In another webinar, Michele Tucci gave figures for the Credolab score, based on mobile phone data for an instance in your Hubei province. Here too, the Gini coefficient dropped from 38% to 30%, only to bounce back, but default rates were nonetheless higher, 1.7% before, 2.3% after. Hence, there is a general pattern. Scoring models lose and then regain their ranking ability, while overall default rates worsen and take longer to return to prior levels, if ever. There is a lag before scores react, mostly due to predictor definitions and their reactiveness. But once moving, they move quickly. This observation is deceiving though. FICO scores are based almost exclusively on obligation data, existing, past, and hoped-for loans, and other contractual obligations. Credolabs rely on communications behavior. Both have a narrow base that reacts and recovers swiftly. They provide value, but their data is incomplete. By contrast, credit rating agencies have a much fuller picture when setting grades for companies, countries, and cities. But much of the data is soft, sticky, or relates to specific industries and locales. Further, they consider not only probabilities, but also loss severities and the ability to handle stressed scenarios. And today, COVID-19 has been a huge shock, the worst pandemic since the Spanish flu of 1918. The cost in lives has been much less, but the economic impact has been huge. Unfortunately, comparisons are difficult. The Spanish flu started during World War I and slowed the post-war recovery. By contrast, COVID-19 arrived when many economies were buoyant. Some bubbles have been broken, while others have been created or enlarged. Both governments and businesses have reacted. Much has been shooting from the hip. Quick actions taken with great uncertainty regarding both risks and results. It reminded me of a recent movie, a comedy that my wife would not appreciate, about a sheep farmer forced into a gunfight with an outlaw. Lots of shooting practice, lots of misses. Jokes aside, it has been more a war than a gunfight, a war against a microbial enemy on a scale not seen since the Second World War. Lives have been saved in the short term, but at what cost? Governments moved quickly to ensure adequate medical facilities, but havoc resulted from restrictions that were intended to limit the spread. Restrictions on movement and socialization, business operations, and sales of goods have led to income losses, business failures, and a breakdown of traditional economic relationships. Confidence fell with reduced spending and investment, and increased saving by those who can. People are working from home and have reduced their social circles, while the digital revolution has accelerated. The cure seems worse than the disease, but the cure seemed reasonable at the time. One wonders if it has been administered inappropriately or too long. Only hindsight will tell once the fog clears. In many poorer countries, people have been cut off from medical and other services, while the specter of starvation is looming. If nothing else, the disease's acceleration has been brought into check, even if some countries have not peaked and others are experiencing further waves. That aside, governments have taken serious measures to mitigate the effects of their restrictions. Things like unemployment and social grants, small and other business support, lowered interest rates, and legislated forbearance. These may prove problematic in future, especially when such cures are like addictive drugs, which may be demanded even after the disease is cured. At the same time, businesses had to adapt. The impacts of the pandemic have not been equal, or the timing was different, whether by geography, industry, or employment. Many businesses were forced to admit failure and close their doors, while others tried to survive through retrenchments, pay cuts, or moving into new lines of business. For those still employed, work from home became standard. Customers switched to digital channels. Even my wife, a psychologist, was doing remote counseling, something that previously was not allowed. There was also increased tolerance to recognize that causing others to fail might cause us to fail. More should be said about work from home, as it will probably become entrenched. It presented challenges in technology, motivation, personal communication, performance monitoring, and psychological well-being, especially when people are online all the time, unable to socialize normally, and potentially unable to decouple from their work and have a life. That said, it has not been the bogeyman that it was expected to be. In many cases, productivity increased, with no commuting and a relaxing home environment. Meetings are shorter and more meetings are held. One might expect much new office construction to be put on hold, except to accommodate those for whom unplanned hallway and water cooler meetings play a role. On grooming, a question that work-from-home newscasters often posed to each other was, "Are you wearing pants today?" A question especially appropriate when all you ever see is a talking head. As regards model risk, it is not an issue when models play a minor role, but they are increasingly used by companies that create data and capitalize upon it. McKinsey Analytics assessed COVID-19's impact on different sectors according to their reliance on models and the model instability created by the pandemic. It should be no surprise that retail, communications, and banking are in the critical count. The white dots are sectors where greater detail is provided within their article, which is a recommended read. Our focus is lenders, no matter which sector they are in, who have taken action at different points in the credit cycle. Several common factors were noted beyond those already mentioned. First, greater drill down allowed lenders to adjust their responses according to what was happening on the ground. Where the focus was on individuals, macro data was used to identify groups at risk, whether by probability, severity, or both. And wherever possible, new data sources were added to the mix. Early warning signals went beyond the norm of early delinquencies and changes in limit utilization. The radar system was expanded, whether at the individual or aggregate level. Many lenders look to data regarding other contractual payments and day-to-day transactions as job loss indicators, and in some instances, web scraping or industry surveys were conducted for for sentiment analysis. Beyond those, changes vary depending upon the area. In originations, pre-approved offers were suspended. Lending criteria tightened. Judgment came to play a greater role, and where feasible, other data sources were brought to bear. The changes in criteria were not necessarily consistent, though, but were adapted to different geographic and industry circumstances. And with restrictions to mobility, there was a significant shift to digital channels. Lenders responded by investing in upgrades, especially given the expectation that these digital channels are the future. Lenders also sought opportunities in areas less affected by the crisis, who were benefiting, like takeaway restaurants in the suburbs. Account management reacted with proactive payment deferrals, credit limit reductions, and a suspension of authorizations for over-limit and delinquent accounts. Even where there were no signs, materiality was high, or the relationship deemed important, customers were contacted to assess their situation and needs. In some cases, models were used to identify at-risk customers so that the burden could be shifted from inbound to outbound call centers, or to identify customers who might draw against what were inactive accounts. Efforts were also made to identify opportunities, like giving bonus loyalty points for credit cards use at those businesses that were open, or allowing travel points use for other purchases or payments. In collections, there was greater accommodation and a softening of the collections voice. Where collections calls were made, education was required for agents to change their tactics. Work from home affected both collectors and the people they called. Collectors typically work in high-stress environments with a rah-rah atmosphere meant to motivate them, and one might have expected their productivity to drop. It seems, however, that the relaxed home environment had the opposite effect. Productivity increased. As for debtors, work from home allowed them to reduce transport, social, and grooming expenses, and they were easier to contact. And finally, accounting and finance. While models' ranking ability was affected, their probability and severity estimates were crippled, which has severe implications for loss provisioning and capital adequacy. This situation is complicated by the complexity of some of the models employed, chain reactions. As a result, judgment played an even greater role than elsewhere, sometimes to the exclusion of existing models. References were made to prior shock periods, like the subprime crisis, but much was guesswork. That music is dramatic, the Imperial March from Star Wars, one that inspires dread. I recently came across a joke about somebody who went to the optician to have his eyes tested because he kept on seeing that his world was falling apart. The optician told him that he has 20/20 vision. Jokes aside, the future is uncertain. Shocks and distortions have occurred, or aftershocks are expected. I've classified these into 4 different categories: data, crutches, patterns, and assumptions. These are imperfect, but at least provide a starting point for discussion. No doubt, other people will come up with different. Data shocks are those immediately reflected in the data, whether as a result of the pandemic itself or responses to it. For responses, much relates to forbearance, as it distorts the risk picture because arrears are not properly reported. That is before one considers the potential errors that can arise. Many lenders were caught unprepared and had to make quick changes, whether in core banking systems, account aging processes, or in collections. Crutch shocks are those that arise once crutches like forbearance, grants, and low interest rates are removed. Collectors will have a significant task. In some instances, people are expecting the crutches to remain. In Canada, a basic income grant had been proposed at levels both inconceivable and unaffordable for most countries, and the crisis has heightened calls for its implementation. Pattern shocks are those where relationships that were taken for granted or which were changing only slowly no longer hold true. COVID-19 has caused significant changes in how we work, socialize, play, travel, and shop. These have not settled, and shifts may be permanent. For example, housing preferences will shift to less inhabited suburbs and satellite cities. Work from home will mean less demand for office space and transportation. When choosing suppliers, proximity and stability of supply will play a greater role, and cost of product less, and so on. Assumption shocks are similar to pattern shocks, but rather than saying we do not know, they indicate we did not consider. Low inflation is associated with low credit risk, and buoyant stock markets with job growth, which are now not the case. Many economic models only considered positive values, never negative. That proved a problem in the United States as negative interest rates loomed, and more broadly, when oil prices went negative. Of course, models will need to be recalibrated or redeveloped in the storm's immediate aftermath. There will be competing demands from different areas looking to protect their own business silos, and some prioritization will be necessary. The order should be based upon the model's importance within the business and the extent of the decay. People may be fighting other fires, but such efforts should start sooner rather than later, but not too soon. If actions are taken too quickly, model risks can arise from the choices that are made. What target definition? What observation and outcome windows? Is the methodology still appropriate? Have we missed something? We know that the new normal will not be like the old, but there should be recognizable similarities such that we can make decisions and be cognizant of the risks. An issue will be how to treat the shock period, especially given the uncertain effects of forbearance. One option is to ignore the shock period and focus only on the predictors before and outcomes after, so that we can identify those most likely to survive the shocks. Another is to wait and allow things to settle. This will likely be addressed on a case-by-case basis. Further into the future, we must make it easier to adapt to shocks of any sort. Even if events are thought to occur only once every 10,000 years, next year could be that year, and we will have to adjust. If one considers past pandemics with deaths of over 1 million, they are a once-in-20-year occurrence, which knocks them out of the Black Swan League. We could build this experience into future models, but general opinion is that our efforts are better spent on improving response times. When preparing this presentation, Pravin highlighted some quotations by Sun Tzu, which are often quoted in management circles. These are especially relevant in these trying times, but with some qualifications. When it comes to shocks, all we can ever know is that we do not know the enemy. We can only know ourselves. We can prepare for battle and hope we have the intelligence to survive better than the rest. There is the old joke, if you are being chased by a lion, you do not have to run faster than the lion, just faster than the other guy. I made reference to the Old West and gunslinging, a practice that could be considered a martial art with a bang. To survive, one needs quality tools, the ability to anticipate opponents' actions, and lots of shooting practice. Lender's immediate reactions were to shoot from the hip. That is, the speed of decision-making was more important than the quality of the decision. But quality can be improved with the right equipment, lots of practice, and the right skills. For us, the question becomes, what equipment and skills do we need? A part of this is to ensure appropriate governance, no matter whether gunslingers are bad or honorable men. This applies across the spectrum of activities to control errant cowboys. Not just a sheriff, but a force with the necessary authority, responsibility, strength, talent, and respect to ensure effective and appropriate actions. With those should come agility, an ability to adapt to changing circumstances, not just those from environmental and competitive pressures, but also shocks. It goes hand in hand with intelligence to recognize when that ability is needed. Ideally, it should be cat-like concerning forbearance, strategy identification, data and monitoring, and models. Forbearance has proven to be a major channel, having the ability to communicate with customers and take the necessary actions quickly. The questions of who, where, how, and why immediately come to mind. Such moves can lead to better customer relations. Strategy adjustments are also an issue. Are simple changes sufficient? Are judgmental overlays required? Can challenger models be brought into play? Processes are required to guide the choice and implementation of the best course of action, including the necessary governance. Data and monitoring are closely linked. Obvious factors are to ensure that their quality, update more frequently, and use existing sources more effectively, like being able to define new characteristics or include available but ignored sources. New and alternative sources should also be included, whether at the micro or macro level. Where there was no use case, there might be one now. Privacy concerns may apply at the micro level, but not macro, nor for most businesses. In countries where open banking is in place or planned, it will be a valuable source, second only to obligational data for the consumer market. As regards models and methodologies, we require tools to identify which action to take. One key factor will be to streamline the production and governance processes. Another is to ensure that models' transparency is consistent with their materiality, or that transparent challenger models are available in need. Many engaged in machine learning and artificial intelligence focus heavily on models' predictive abilities and fail to consider their robustness. There is a move towards interpretable machine learning, but it focuses mostly on the predictor-prediction relationship and much less on the predictor outcome, i.e. the reliability of results. The latter can be provided with some imagination, but in its absence, one should have a backup plan. Okay, we're now in the home stretch. The Toastmasters Club has a saying regarding speech making. You should tell them what you will say, tell them, and then tell them what you said. We are at that last point, but let's just focus on the highlights. As indicated earlier, the last few months have been a war against a microbial enemy. Someone once described war as long periods of boredom, broken by extreme terror. The quotation first appeared in December of 1914, shortly after the onset of World War I. It was probably written in a letter home by somebody who did not survive the trenches. Life differs, however, in that we hope to prosper when times are boring and survive the terror. And it is possible to better prepare ourselves for survival through appropriate planning and resourcing. As regards model risk, it is an issue generally wherever and however models are used to guide decisions. Shocks are not model risks of themselves, but present model risks where they are not handled appropriately. Model risk management has evolved to address those risks, shock or not. It is just more challenging when there are shocks, putting pressure on all lines of defense and the communications processes between them. Of course, shocks will affect the performance of existing models. Predictions will not adjust immediately, especially when key inputs are not updated regularly. Rankings will likely recover quickly, but expected loss calculations will probably be severely compromised due to the combination of higher loss probabilities and severities. These impacts will not be even though, and both greater data analysis and judgment will be required. COVID-19 has put us to the test, both government and business. Many of the reactions were shooting from the hip, often judgmental decisions based on incomplete data. Insufficient time has passed for us to view this in hindsight, the only businesses that have benefited are technology companies as a result of distance everything, especially online shopping and work from home. For the future, two things are immediately evident. In the near term, our models will need to be monitored closely. Simple changes may suffice, but it is more likely that recalibration or redevelopment will be necessary. For the longer term, we need to recognize what we have learned and ensure that going forward we are appropriately prepared. We need to become better gunslingers, but at the same time ensure that there is a good sheriff in town. A robust environment will result in better reactions. This includes having the necessary intelligence capabilities to inform our decisions, the right people with the right mindsets, processes that can be adjusted to the task, and appropriate infrastructure. Thank you, and we'll be looking forward to your questions.